When I compare modern Beowulf translations, things can get pretty nitpicky. For example, one of the reasons I like Fulk's translation is that he gives high kings for Theod Kuniga instead of the more common people kings or folk kings, which I think are actually misreadings of Theod. That's a pretty small detail, it doesn't really affect your reading of the poem, and at the end of the day, even when I complain about bad translations, we are all still working within one school of Old English, wherein we mostly agree on what happens in the poem and what most of the words mean. This was not the case in the early 19th century when the first Beowulf translations were coming out. And today I'd like to tell you the story of the absolutely crazy argument that took place in 1834 when Cambridge scholar John Mitchell Kemble launched a vicious, unprovoked attack against Oxford Old English scholars and was met with equal vitriol in response. The result was a fierce argument about Beowulf translations over the course of 10 articles by various Oxford and Cambridge scholars, hurling insults at each other in the journal aptly named The Gentleman's Magazine. This is one of my favorite stories in Beowulf scholarship, and I can't wait to share it with you. Stay tuned. First, some context. The year is 1834, and it has been 19 years since the first Beowulf translation was published by the Icelander Grímur Jónsson Þorkelin. Immediately the poem became a subject for petty squabbling, as a Danish scholar, NFS Grundtvig, published a review pointing out a few mistakes. Þorkelin responded angrily, and the ensuing argument was so toxic that the editor of the journal they were using to communicate had to intervene and shut it down. During this time, the science that we now call comparative philology, that is, comparing related languages to learn more about their history, this is, by the way, what tells us most of what we know about historical linguistics today, is only in its infancy, and not many people believe in it yet. Its proponents are mostly Danish and German, including the Brothers Grimm, and the ideas are still very new and not very popular in the British academies. Of all the English scholars of Old English, by this point only a few had enthusiastically embraced comparative philology, notably an independent scholar named Benjamin Thorpe, and two Cambridge men, Joseph Bosworth, who had not yet published his famous Dictionary of Old English, and today's main character, John Mitchell Kemble. Consequentially, when the extremely well-respected Oxford Rawlinsonian professor of Anglo-Saxon John Josias Conybeare published his translation of Beowulf, the first Englishman to do so, he did so without any knowledge of comparative philology, and the translation was a complete train wreck. However, the only people who would have been able to tell were those who had studied Germanic languages intensively, and in England that meant basically no one, so the translation became very popular on respect for Conybeare's name alone. In April of 1834, the 27-year-old John Mitchell Kemble, a former student of Jacob Grimm's and recent graduate of Trinity College at Cambridge, has recently released his own edition of the Beowulf text, which his compatriots have largely ignored. Perhaps out of frustration over this, he decides to write a review of his friend Benjamin Thorpe's recent book on Old English, and takes the opportunity to open with a several paragraph long tirade against Oxford University and its Old English scholars. I'll read to you what he says. It will certainly be to all times a difficult problem to determine how, when year after year so many persons have been taking up this pursuit, when one of our universities actually possesses a professorship expressly meant for its encouragement, referring of course to the Rawlinsonian professor's seat, which 100 years later is actually held by Tolkien, so little should at this moment have resulted from the efforts made. He goes on to list a few important names who have studied Old English, and then says, "Yet, in spite of the many who before and after them put their hand to the plough, the work has never proceeded. And had it not been for the industry of Danes and Germans, and those who drew from the wellheads of their learning, that is, me, we might still be where we were, with idle texts, idle grammars, idle dictionaries, and the consequences of all these, idle and ignorant scholars." The only approach which we can make to a solution of this strange problem is that the study, being a little out of the way of men's usual pursuits, has been stared at and wondered at, and that those who did give themselves to it and become megalataumata, which means like great miracles in Greek, I think that's a Bible reference, thereby, have had their heads turned, and having so lost the better part of their senses, have entirely forgotten what they did when they first began Greek or Latin, namely, that they first learnt at great length and with much pains the grammar of these tongues, and then, by means of the dictionary and the authors, having become competent scholars, ventured or not according as their humor led them upon editing books themselves. This process, our Saxonists hitherto, with extremely few exceptions, have diametrically reversed. Most have begun by editing books which they could not hope to understand, and though some may have succeeded during the progress of their work in picking up a little of the grammar, the great majority certainly have not. We could mention, were we so inclined, doctors, yea, professors of Anglo-Saxon, whose doings in the way of false concords, false etymology, and ignorance of declension, conjugation, and syntax would, if perpetrated by a boy in the second form of public school, have richly merited and been duly repaid by a liberal application of ferula or dire birch, which of course means getting caned. Kemble goes on and eventually actually does get to a review of Benjamin Thorpe's book, albeit with several more insults at Oxford scholars thrown in, but this tirade does not go without response. In August and September, two anonymous Oxford scholars published their own rebukes. Publishing anonymously was pretty common back then, and here it's a great way to say basically whatever you want about your opponent without any consequences. The first response begins by praising the editor of the Gentleman's Magazine, saying that usually your articles are so good. But then he says, there is, however, an article in your number for April last, in page 391, which is so flippant, so confident, and yet so incorrect in its statements, that it evidently emanates from a mere tyro, which means like beginner, and has by accident slipped into your pages. In my opinion, it is only like a little muddy brook, which has no other effect than, for a short space, to discolor your steady stream. Still, the pedantry, and I will add the injustice of this article, has displeased many of your old supporters, who are indignant at the manner in which some of their friends have been unnecessarily attacked, and have determined to act upon the defensive in other periodicals. I have hitherto restrained them by observing that Mr. Urban, the pen name for the editor, is just, and will gladly insert any of their remarks. As they have not yet replied, I take up my pen to convince them that you will do justice by allowing a defense equal circulation with the charge. Forgetting the important caution gnauthi seauton, which means know thyself in Greek, and overconfident in his imaginary powers, your correspondent accuses Anglo-Saxon scholars of the most incompetent ignorance, and of committing such blunders as would, if perpetrated by a boy in the second form of a public school, have richly merited and been dearly repaid by a liberal application of ferula or dire birch. I believe it will not be difficult to prove, in my next letter, that these remarks are more applicable to your correspondent than to those whom he would wish to apply them. Being anxious for the cause of truth that this letter should appear in your number for August, I will only add that I am yours, etc., I.J. I.J. is the pen name for one of the two Oxford scholars that we're going to see here today in this argument. The other responds in the September edition, following up on his colleague's remarks. Mr. Urban, which again is the pen name for the editor of the magazine, his real name was Edward Cave, but people would send articles to him as if they were letters. Your insertion of J.I.'s letter, that is the last one that we just read, in your last number, is a proof that your exterior attractions have not warped your old principles of justice in allowing persons accused full liberty of speaking for themselves. As J.I. is now engaged, I happily step forward in defense of my calumniated friends, calumniated means like slandered against, who have done real service to Anglo-Saxon literature by their published works. Your mind, like theirs, is too well informed, and your feelings too alive to the real worth of Old England, to be carried away by the fine-spun theories of a few German literati, who in divinity, philosophy, and even in philology, have winged their flight so far into the higher, or rather into the lower regions, as not only to enter into palpable darkness themselves, but by their mysticism have decoyed a few inexperienced followers. We have no longer Anglo-Saxon, but German-Saxon. Some of our half-educated countrymen, after spending a few months on the continent, and this of course is a reference to Kemble studying with Jakob Grimm, return surcharged not only with gloomy ideas on divinity, but even upon philology. But I hasten to answer some of the unfounded assertions of your critic from April in page 391. This writer is not satisfied with the effort of noticing his friend's Analecta, which is the name of the book that Benjamin Thorpe published that Kemble was supposed to be writing a review on. Without going aside to depreciate the important labors of others, hear his declaration. In Saxon literature, little but the most incompetent ignorance has hitherto been witnessed. We have idle texts, idle grammars, idle histories, and the consequences of all these, idle and ignorant scholars. As for a dictionary or glossary, even to this day there is none. We say this most advisedly, page 392. Can the critic be so ignorant on the subject as not to know that there is a valuable Anglo-Saxon dictionary, and then he lists a few reference texts that were circulating on the time. These were okay, they're nothing on the level of the current dictionaries that we have, but they were respected, especially Lie's dictionary, which Kemble did not like, and the second Oxford scholar references that here. But further, the critic commends in his friend's Analecta what he condemns in Lie. He asserts, if ever a book was calculated to do harm, to retard the progress of a study, to perplex and fill with trouble the mind of a learner, Lie's Dictionary is assuredly that book. He goes on to sing the praises of Lie's Dictionary, and then takes an aside to make a really funny remark asking whether or not anyone knows what has become of Joseph Bosworth and his promised dictionary. He comments that Bosworth is currently on the continent, and says that he hopes that he doesn't get corrupted by the German scholars there. Well, unfortunately for this guy, that is exactly what happens. The Bosworth Dictionary is full of comparative philology, but that hasn't happened yet. Anyway, this anonymous Oxford scholar continues, but I have not done with your critic, who is so dependent upon the learning strings of Danes and Germans that he ventures not a step without them. Where they support he is bold. He seems to be so fond of the broad figure and dowdy dress of Germans that nothing will satisfy him but the clothing of the Saxon vowels in their dress. Here is a specimen, and then he shows a few of the diacritics that Kemble used in his Beowulf edition. Some of these are pretty silly. For example, we have an E here with a diaresis above it. That means an E that comes from A in Proto-Germanic as opposed to A. Do we really need to identify that when reading Old English? Probably not. But these diacritics were very popular among the early philologists, and they kind of still are. For example, we still mark palatalization in Old English as well as vowel length. Following this, the anonymous Oxford scholar writes, Risum teneatis amici, which is a Horace reference. It means like, can you hold your laughter, please? Is this anything like plain, honest English? And the still plainer Saxon? Ooh, plain Saxon. Now that is a very telling phrase. We have to remember that even until the mid-20th century, but especially in the early 19th century, people thought genuinely that the Old English were so stupid that they couldn't have had a complicated language like Greek or Latin. So the language must not really be worth studying that much, and that's why a lot of scholars didn't understand it. He continues talking about Kemble's edition of Beowulf. Even Mr. Kemble has not gone to the same length in his accentuation of Beowulf, but he has had the presumption, without knowing anything on the subject, to add innumerable accents which are not in the manuscript, and this is referring to vowel length, which of course is still marked in most Beowulf editions today. But again, we only really know about vowel length because of comparative philology, and if you didn't understand comparative philology, then these accents probably made no sense to you. He will answer, I know they ought to be there. The fact is, he knows nothing about the matter, for he prints a considerable part of his Beowulf before he discovers he has been committing a serious error in every page. Then, instead of honestly confessing his ignorance, he honorably lays the blame upon Rask, a famous Danish scholar. I give you his own language. I have, upon Dr. Rask's authority, written was eram, eram meaning was in Latin. It was really common to gloss these words with Latin equivalents, with a long ash. During the time the sheets were passing through the press, I fully satisfied my mind that the lamented scholar had erred, and through the rest of the book I have not accentuated the preterite singular. It must be observed that this is not the first edition of Beowulf. It was first published by Thorkelin with a Latin translation and notes. Much of the poem has been translated into English by Mr. Turner. That's referring to the historian Sharon Turner, who published a few snippets of Beowulf in 1805. And the text corrected by an entire collation and a considerable part of it translated by Conybeare. When much light had been thrown on the poem, Mr. Kemble came and put all into darkness by publishing the mere text, loaded with German accents, without even common punctuation to guide the sense, or a word of translation or illustration. This is excusable, as he published his book for Grimm, and the few who are chained in his sound iron-bound system, to them this edition of Beowulf is addressed. This system is referring, of course, to comparative philology. Verily it is iron-bound, and I appeal to every unbiased man, if anything can be more applicable than your critic's own words. If ever a book was calculated to do harm, to retard the progress of a study, to perplex and fill the mind with trouble, Mr. Kemble's Beowulf is assuredly that book. And he signs T.W., which will be the pen name for the other anonymous Oxford scholar that we will encounter in this debate. Okay, so those are the two responses to Kemble's initial attack from Oxford. Kemble at this time, being September of 1834, is on the continent and can't respond. Instead, an anonymous Cambridge scholar comes to his defense, saying, "Certain correspondents, in the last two numbers of your magazine," talking again to the editor, "who respectively sign themselves J.I. and T.W., have complained of your excellent and spirited article on Mr. Thorpe's Analectica Anglo-Saxonica." That is, of course, the first article that Kemble wrote in which he attacked the Oxford scholars. "I confess that I cannot understand exactly the grounds on which they found so querulous and indeed peevish an attack, nor can I see the object at which they aim. The first letter promised us a complete vindication of the unerring accuracy of the old school of Saxon scholars, and in addition to that, an undeniable proof of the ignorance of the writer of the article alluded to, being Kemble. The second correspondent, as far as I can judge, seems to have done much less towards proving the aforesaid writer's ignorance than towards exhibiting his own. It is not by such violent and injudicious proceedings that learning is likely to be benefited. The same experience which has shown to me the feebleness and unsafeness of the writers, in whom your correspondents glory as guides, has proved to me that the Analectica of Mr. Thorpe is an admirable book, and meagre as those correspondents may think the glossary, because it does not seem to them to cover much paper. I am inclined to think that if either of them were properly acquainted with it, they would know more Anglo-Saxon than to abuse either that book or Mr. Kemble's Beowulf, to attack which the latter of them seems to have gone a long way from his proper and congenial path. I can very easily imagine that he may find some difficulty in understanding that poem, but is it right to lay the blame of this upon its editor? Or upon his accents, which, evidently not understanding them, he is simple enough to deride? He takes a couple paragraphs to level his own attack against Lie's dictionary, defending Kemble's comments and attacking the comments of the Oxford scholars, and then finishes, "I am sorry, Mr. Urban, that this subject should have been entered upon in the spirit which characterizes the letter of both your correspondents, as if Kemble didn't start it. Let them examine candidly this German system, as they call it. Let them make themselves acquainted with it, and if they find that it is false, then let them expose it openly, and show its defects. If it be unsound, it will not long stand the test, but I am certain that no good can come of people laughing at what they will not labor a little first to understand." In the same volume, this being the October release of the Gentleman's Magazine, and literally on the next page, the second Oxford scholar publishes another attack on Kemble's Beowulf. He says, in his preface to Beowulf, page 25, Mr. Kemble says, "I have printed the text letter for letter, as I found it. This I deny, for, though the other day I had only a few minutes to examine the manuscript, I found in the first folio, Fientharve, printed by Mr. Kemble, line 28, for Firentharve. If, in the first few lines, we discover accents misplaced and an error in the literal expression of a word, what may we expect in the whole book? In the progress of his work, he acknowledges he has found some words ought to have been differently accented. What then can be more applicable than your critic's own words? He has begun by editing a book which he could not hope to understand, and though he may have succeeded, during the progress of the work, in picking up a little of the grammar, we could mention the name of a would-be Anglo-Saxon professor, whose doings in the way of false accentuation, false etymology, etc., would, if perpetrated by a boy in the second form of a public school, have richly merited and been duly repaid by a liberal application of ferula or dire birch. Your critic asserts, etymology must be inborn, poeta nascitur non fit, which means a poet is born, not made. Very few persons will consequently be found either capable of pursuing etymological inquiries or justified in doing so. How can we account for this poetical flight into the regions of nonsense? Your critic shall answer in his own elegant style. The only approach we can make to the solution of this strange problem is that the study, being a little out of the way of men's usual pursuits, has been stared at and wondered at, and that he, who gave himself to it, and became megatauma, which again means like a great wonder, thereby, has had his head turned, and lost the better part of his senses. He finishes saying, "I beg your readers will recollect this is not an unprovoked attack upon Mr. Kemble and his friends, but an answer excited by their unwarranted aspersions. Yours, etc., T.W." Of course, not to be outdone, now another anonymous Cambridge scholar in the same page adds his own 2 cents to the equation. "Mr. Urban, truth, and not the predominance of a party, ought to be the pursuit of every scientific and literary man. I wish our Anglo-Saxon students would constantly bear this in mind when they write on disputed points. There is room enough for all. Should anyone imagine that he has superior powers and more extensive knowledge, then let him not attempt to show them by haughty or angry expressions, but by his useful and valuable publications. I am no enemy to discussion, for by the collision of opposite opinions new light is often elicited, but the greatest benefit is derived where the discussion is calm, and a dignified tone of writing sustained. In the few remarks I have to make, it will be my endeavor to avoid the influence of a party spirit. Referencing, of course, the fact that right now it's pretty obviously a fight between the scholars of Oxford and the scholars of Cambridge. This article actually is very tame and pretty short. I won't read the whole thing, but this right here is interesting. I think T.W., being the second Oxford scholar, the one that took issue with the accentuation, must acknowledge that accents are found in Anglo-Saxon manuscripts, and that they are useful. In many cases, they serve to distinguish one word from another, as ock but and ock an oak. In trying to defend Kemble's accentuation, he does make a mistake. These accents are common in the manuscripts, but they don't always and actually rarely indicate vowel length. That said, when editors use them to indicate vowel length, it is very important. The word ock, meaning but, is different than the word ock, meaning oak. His second example is particularly illustrative because those two words, is, meaning is, and ease, meaning ice, have come to have different sounds in modern English, so they must have had different sounds in Old English. This is what Kemble's referring to with the iron-bound system of philology, the fact that we know that these were two different vowel lengths, not just because they become two different sounds in modern English, but because they are also two different sounds in other Germanic languages. Take, for example, German East and Eis. That's the main thrust of this article, and like he promised, the scholar did keep it congenial and professional, and took a step towards maybe getting over this whole argument. And then, in November, Kemble arrived back in England. Mr. Urban, before I left England in the month of August, I read a letter in your magazine threatening me with a critique, in which all my pretensions to scholarship were to be annihilated, and the character of the University of Oxford, supposed to be attacked in some remarks of mine, was to be vindicated by the downfall of an arrogant assailant. As I never look for much proficiency in these matters from Oxford men, I confess this gasconade gave me very little concern. I was content that your correspondents should rail now, in the hope that they might hereafter learn. In fact, I looked upon the whole proceeding as no more than one bubble of the effervescence produced by the installation of their new Chancellor, who is actually the Duke of Wellington, and I thought that at least as much indignation was aimed against the Cambridge man and the Whig as against the inaccurate scholar. Kemble was a Whig, and very proud to be a Whig. Though my opinion upon this point remains unaltered, yet having read the remarks which were thus announced, paraded, and introduced with a flourish of drums and trumpets, I find them to be written in a spirit of such bitterness, and to be filled with envy, hatred, malice, and all uncharitableness, that I have relinquished the intention which I had at first of treating your correspondent with a good-natured but entire disregard. He has struck too hard at me not to receive a lesson which I trust shall teach him for the future to be a little more cautious with whom he meddles. The opinion which I entertain of himself will be made pretty apparent in the course of these remarks. It is, however, of somewhat greater importance to reduce the ignorant respect which is paid to the school of which he has officiously constituted himself the champion, to its proper measure. I hope to put it upon the same footing at home as it occupies abroad, referring to the fact that a lot of Danish and German scholars laughed at the repeated mistakes of the English scholars. Its foundations are neither wide nor deep, and I feel very curious to see whether a vigorous shake will not bring the clumsy edifice to the ground. The errors in my book were very numerous. A good scholar might have detected many. Your Oxford correspondent, with all the will to do as much mischief as possible, has succeeded in finding a clerical error, in correcting which he commits a far greater. He objects to my writing Firentarve because, as he says, the manuscript reads Fientarve. The manuscript reads no such thing, and could read no such thing. It reads Firentarve. And here, as the fact-checker, I will say that Kemble is 100% right here. The manuscript does read Firentarve, and it couldn't read Fientarve because Fientarve isn't a word. From whatever causes the errors in my text arose, or to what amount they exist, I shall leave your correspondent to seek in the edition of my book now printing. He will find them collected for him in a table of errata. So Kemble actually is producing another new edition of his Beowulf text as he's writing this. But I tell him that he can charge me with none but clerical errors, and something more is necessary, for his querulous abuse of the German school, of my mysticism, etc., etc., are flowers of rhetoric, not of the newest or most effective kind. In order to make out the case which he imagined himself to possess against me, it was necessary to show that I was ignorant of the forms and construction of the Saxon language, that I myself committed blunders which I laid to the charge of others, that I had mistaken adjectives for substantives and substantives for adjectives, that I had made preterites of imperatives and joined datives plural with genitives. I can see nothing of all of this in the letters of your correspondent or correspondents. T.W. is very indignant with me for having ventured to remark advisedly that we have hitherto witnessed little but the most incompetent ignorance, and by a vast exertion of intellect he seems to have come to the conclusion that the Oxford professors might possibly be alluded to. He is right, they were alluded to, and advisedly. Why they were so I will tell him anon, and if I do him justice in believing him to be incapable of having made the discovery for himself, he will probably feel no little surprise at the information. He continues, Dare Mr. Kemble attribute the most incompetent ignorance to such scholars as Dr. Ingram, Professor Conybeare, and the learned and accurate Sharon Turner, together with a long list of subordinate worthies, who must no doubt feel astounded at the honor of ranking with the first great names, and who perhaps may think that they owe their uncomfortable position less to any merits of their own than to T.W.'s necessity of making up a long list of great men. Kemble dismisses Ingram and Turner and all the other scholars mentioned. He's after the crown. He wants to go after Oxford's most prestigious Anglo-Saxon professor, that is, the now-deceased John Josias Conybeare, whose Beowulf translation is still the most respected in England at the time. I believe, and if there be any gentleman who considers himself to possess greater claims to my attention, I entreat that I may be informed of his name with all speed, that Professor John Josias Conybeare is considered to stand at the head of the modern Oxford School of Anglo-Saxon. He is more particularly fitted to be the subject of my examination, because he was the first person in England who gave anything like an account of Beowulf, and was one of those who threw much light upon the poem, before I came with a system of German philology and accentuation to throw it all into darkness again. I shall now investigate the nature of the light which this professor of the University of Oxford threw upon Beowulf, leaving those who are in any way interested in the matter to return their thanks to the meddling friend, who compelled me to bring that gentleman's merits into public notice. He then goes into a full review of Conybeare's edition of Beowulf, saying, if you're going to accuse me of not understanding the Old English language, then let's see how someone does who you do think understands this language. He begins by saying, these things may do at Oxford, but they will not do at Göttingen, at Munich, or at Cambridge. Göttingen and Munich, of course, being two seats of the German Philological School. And this is just insane. Leaving unnoticed 3 inaccuracies in page 82, I pass to the 4th line of page 83, which in the book of the most celebrated Anglo-Saxon professor in the University of Oxford stands thus, Buton folkshare on ferum gumina, which he translates as praeter populi turbam et pravos vel peregrinos homines. That kind of means like except for the crowd of people and the evil or traveling people. Again, like I said, Conybeare's translation was a bit of a train wreck. This doesn't make any sense. It's not an accurate translation at all. And that does not escape Kemble. Folksharu is populi portio, the people's share, which Hrothgar had it not to give, but this is not important. What is important is that the professor should have construed the dative plural feorum in concord with the genitive plural gumina. Feorch, vita, meaning life, rejects its final h in all cases but the nominative and accusative singular, and this was a piece of knowledge which should have preserved us from an adjective feor peregrinus, meaning traveler. The meaning of the passage is that Hrothgar promised to distribute in his new hall such wealth as God had given into his hands, except the portion of the people, and the lives of men. I do not know at what school T.W. may have been brought up, but I do know that from a second-form boy, who should have construed a dative and genitive plural in concord in the schools where I was brought up, would have got what he deserved, a sound flogging. In the same page of the same book, I find the following passage. He beot ne alech, which he translates as ibi invitatos collocavit, meaning like there he collected or gathered the people that he had invited. Fortified by the following note, I have considered Beowulf with Thorkelin as irregularly formed from Biddan. Biddan means like to ask in Old English, so he's saying here that he thinks Beowulf is the past participle of Biddan, so the people that were asked. If Alech be formed, as I apprehend, from Aledjan, Kolokawit will be a closer translation than Thorkelin's excapit. So he's saying here that he thinks Alech is the past tense form of Aledjan, which means like to place down in Old English. So maybe place down, that is like he kind of put them there, he gathered them there. Maybe that's what the poet is saying. It's a better translation than Thorkelin's excapit, which means like took out. What does Kemble have to say about this? Great joy to Oxford and TW from their professor's closer translation. The iron-bound system at which TW sneers has, however, taught us that Beotne can neither be an adjective nor formed irregularly from Biddan, nay more, that it is two words and not one, namely Beot, mina, promissio, that is like a promise, a boast, and ne, non, which means no. The preterite of alidjan, to lie down, is alai. The preterite of aledjan, to lay down, is aleide. The professor therefore mistook the preterite of alidjan for that of aledjan, and very uselessly, seeing that alech is the preterite of neither one nor the other, but an extremely common corruption of alach, the preterite of aleoran, mentiri, that is, to lie. The sentence merely means, he belied not his promise, and similar uses of aleoran, yeleoran are constant in Anglo-Saxon poetry. If one were disposed to cavil, which means like to be nitpicky, one might ask why in line 5 of page 84 swutul, manifestus, meaning like clear, was confounded with suete and rendered suavis, meaning sweet. Or why in line 15 of the same page leoman, lumina, or radios, meaning lights, if the professor chooses, should be construed as if it were a dative, leumum. Or why, and this is my favorite, or why in line 3 of page 85, Fivelkin, genus monstruosum, that is like the genus of monsters, should be turned into populus quinque urbes habitans, which means like the people that live in 5 cities. So he saw fief at the beginning of Fevil and thought that it meant 5 as opposed to the word Fevil, which means monster. But these are neither false concords nor blunders in the forms of nouns and adjectives, and are of minor import. This is a long article, and he gives countless examples to prove his point, so I'll skip most of them and just jump to the last one here. Thus much for the principal and only the principal errors of these translations, selected from the first 9 pages of the professor's book. There are others which at any time shall be at the service of your Oxford correspondence, but I have no further space to waste. Only before I close, I will note one more precious specimen of Oxford Anglo-Saxon from page 94. Cuthehe durthe thou, novit ille fidelem ministrum, which means like he knew the faithful servant. The carelessness of mistaking thou, mos, meaning like a custom, for theo, servus, meaning a servant, is not laudable. But what shall we think of making an adjective, fidelis, out of the substantive duruth, a feminine in the genitive singular, and putting the 2 words in concord? Duruth, I beg to inform TW, is not only virtue, but also the important, the older, and the wiser portion of a court, opposed to Yuruth, the young men. But it also means pomp and ceremony of a court, and the passage, which refers to Wulfgar, not to Hrothgar, means he knew the custom of a court. I shall carry this no further at present. Of or from your Oxford correspondent I never again expect to hear, unless indeed he be the same sapient scholar who proposed to reprint Sir John Spellman's Psalter, an interlinear gloss without the Latin text, which alone makes the Saxon intelligible. I actually don't really understand what that reference is to, but he continues, I know not whether he has filled, does fill, or means to fill the Saxon chair in that university, but from the specimen of his ability which he has supplied in these letters, I can assure him that he is worthy to take his place in the long list of illustrious obscures who have already enjoyed that cheap dignity. His ignorance would have obtained for him the pity of my learned German friends, and of myself. His malice, so happily tempered with impotence, has given him a juster title to that which he has obtained, our contempt. Yours, etc., John Kemble. This letter was published in the December edition of the Gentleman's Magazine, and then everyone went home to their families, enjoyed Christmas, and the next year things were a little calmer. Both of the Oxford correspondents wrote again. One of them was rather gracious, the other one was rather angry and said, what's the point of going after Conybeare? He's dead, have you no respect, etc. Kemble gets the final word in July of 1835, where he explains his system of accentuation and then addresses his detractors for a final time, saying that their incognito alone secured them from a different and severer mode of castigation. His final remarks are, "To all those who in the spirit of fair and honorable criticism deal with my remarks, or my editions of books, I am accustomed to listen with such respect as their views deserve, and to all, in whatever school brought up, who seriously put their shoulder to the wheel with me, I hold out the right hand of fellowship. But against all quackery and all quacks, I hold the old motto, war to the knife. Yours, etc., John Kemble." Since you're still here, I trust that you've found this to be just as much of a wild ride as I did when I first read these articles. I think in general I have two takeaways from the whole exchange. The first is that if you don't know what you're talking about, you don't have to publish on it. You can actually just not say anything. The second is, no matter how right you are, if you're a total jerk about it, no one's going to take you seriously. And that was kind of the story of Kemble's life. He had few friends, even Jakob Grimm thought he was kind of crazy, his marriage was a complete disaster, and he died very young at 49 years old. Usually, it's just not worth it to not be professional and or courteous and kind to the people around you. I find it very common that scholars get into this mindset of, I'm allowed to be rude because I know that I'm right. I know that I'm smart, But in real life, there are no Tony Starks. It's never profitable to be rude. It's never profitable to talk down to people, to be condescending. There's just no point, right? So I encourage you to walk away from this not thinking, wow, Kemble is so cool, he really owns those guys, but rather imagine what would have been different if he had taken a nicer tone, right? Imagine how much more early comparative philology might have spread in England if its first proponent hadn't been a total jerk. I hope you've enjoyed this video on what I think is one of the most entertaining scholarly interactions in history. If you like content about Old English, check out the rest of the channel. Kindly consider subscribing or becoming a supporter on Patreon. And until next time, Farathie alle, Yasunde.